Welcome to the sixth lesson in our study of the books of Kings. We are still on chapters 17 through 2 Kings 8. In this week's lesson, we will explore further the northern kingdom of Israel, and we will add in some information from the southern kingdom called Judah. Again, let's have a look at our chart and start off with, just to kind of remind us, we're looking at parallel lines of kings from Israel and from Judah. So last week, we looked at Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, and we looked at Rehoboam and Abijam, who only had a couple years, and then we started the look at Asa. So this week we'll have Asa, and we'll have more of the kings of Israel. And we'll probably touch on Jehoshaphat as well. So we have a look here. I had to make these smaller so that we could show that the number of kings of Israel are much greater than the numbers of Judah. It looks like I made a boo-boo here, and I forgot to put down the ending of King Jehoshaphat's rule, so I'll fix that. So we'll have it up there next week. In 1 Kings chapter 14, we'll go back and take a look at Rehoboam, what he's up to here. During his reign, the people of Judah did what was evil in the Lord's sight, provoking his anger with their sin, for it was even worse than that of their ancestors. For they had also built for themselves pagan shrines and set up sacred pillars and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every green tree. There were even male and female shrine prostitutes throughout the land, and the people imitated the detestable practices of the pagan nations the Lord had driven from the land of head of Israel. So last week we looked at Jeroboam, and we saw how terrible his reign was and how he led the people astray. And here we are back in Judah, who is the line of the descendants of King David, and we have the same problem. The people are having a difficult time, and the leaders are having an even more difficult time because they are not keeping their people true to the Lord. And as we know from the study that we've had keeping on going here in the Old Testament, that whenever things are going astray, there are some consequences. So we have a cause and effect relationship as an explanation for what happens in the history of the people. There was a Pharaoh, Shishak invasion, and the consequent plunder of the temple in Jerusalem are seen as to be a result of the sins of Judah. They foreshadow future plunder and the eventual destruction of the temple. The glory of Solomon's temple is now tarnished in the hands of his son Rehoboam. Rehoboam replaced Solomon's shields of gold with shields made of bronze, and the temple did survive the raid because it was in the place the Lord had chosen. So we saw some of this in the video last week, where we saw Israel, where the tribes and other countries around them had united against the Assyrians, but it had left Judah out in the second time that they united, and as a result, the Pharaoh was able to send his troops into Jerusalem and raid the temple and still leave them as a country, but making them to be more like a vassal state. Abijam was the son of Rehoboam and his favorite wife, Maacah, and they reigned around the years 915 to 913 BCE. So only a couple of years Abijam is ruling. He's also called Abijah, so that gets confusing sometimes. This Abijam sinned as his father had done, that is his father Rehoboam, but he did not suffer the fate of the other Abijah from northern kingdom, Jeroboam's son, who had died prematurely as a child. Clearly, the continuation of the house of David was not due to the righteousness of David's successors in Jerusalem, but it was simply because the will of God to keep the line of David going. In chapter 15, it says that Abijam committed the same sins as his father before him, and he was not faithful to the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had been. But for David's sake, the Lord his God allowed his descendants to continue ruling, shining like a lamp, and he gave Abijam a son to rule after him in Jerusalem. So we see that even though they're falling away from proper worship, the line of David is still continuing. That's the point made here. And the son is Asa. Now, Asa is a different person. He is going to be completely different than the two ancestors before him, his father and grandfather. So he did what was pleasing in the Lord's sight, as his ancestor David had done, and he banished the male and female shrine prostitutes from the land and got rid of all the idols his ancestors had made. He even deposed his grandmother, Maacah, from her position as the queen mother because she had made the obscene Asherah pole. And he cut down the obscene poles and burned it in the Kidron Valley. And although the pagan shrines were not removed, Asa's heart remained completely faithful to the Lord throughout his life. And he brought into the temple of the Lord the silver and gold and various items that he and his father had dedicated. So replacing those items that had been stolen by the king of Egypt. Accordingly, Asa's reign overlapped with 7 counterparts in the north. So when we think back to that parallel line of kings under Israel and under Judah, here is Asa, and there are 7 kings on the other side at the same time as Asa's rule. Jeroboam, Nadab, Baasha, Elah, Zimri, Omri, and the beginning of Ahab's rule. And during all that time, Asa was ruling in Judah. He was, by all accounts, a reformist king who expelled the cult prostitutes and removed all the idols that his predecessors had set up. Boy, I'm having trouble talking today. And he also deposed the queen mother and destroyed the queen mother's cult image of Asherah. Although the high places of the land were not eliminated, Asa's heart was true to the Lord until the day of his death. So he accomplished a lot of cleaning up. But of course, there's still the seed there of pagan ritual. And Jehoshaphat is the son of Asa, so he is next in line. And it is Jehoshaphat who rules during the time of Ahab in Israel. So they are counterparts. Jehoshaphat in Judah and Ahab in Israel. He joined together with Ahab to recapture Ramoth Gilead, and it is during that battle when Ahab is killed. And that's an interesting story if you read that, because it has a lot of symbolism within the story itself of the battle and the 2 kings. And you can read that in chapter 22. Jehoshaphat banished the shrines of the male and female prostitutes also, as his father had done. He built a fleet of ships, and he joined in trading with other countries in Ophir, which we learned a few lessons ago means countries from the south, and he ruled for 25 years. Jehoshaphat was considered a good king, as his father Asa was also considered a good king of Judah. At the end of this, though, there is a really odd story in here about rebuilding Jericho. It's just like doesn't seem to fit in at all, except that I guess it happened during this time period. So it was worthy of mention because it's a throwback to a curse that was told in Joshua chapter 6, verses 26 and 27, when they were getting ready to go in Canaan and they had come to the city of Jericho. So it was during Jehoshaphat's reign that Hiel, a man from Bethel, rebuilt the city of Jericho. And when he laid its foundations, it cost him the life of his oldest son, Abram. And when he completed it and set up its gates, it cost him the life of his youngest son, Segub. This all happened according to a message from the Lord concerning Jericho that was spoken by Joshua, son of Nun. And this is what it said back in the book of Joshua. At that time, Joshua invoked this particular curse. May the curse of the Lord fall on anyone who tries to rebuild the town of Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest son, he will set up its gates. So this is an interesting, just kind of little story in here. First of all, we learned that Jericho probably was a pile of ruins at the time that the Israelites were beginning to come into the land of Canaan. And why this particular curse was mentioned is not really known, except that we know from later readings that the firstborn and youngest sons were living sacrifices. So in other words, the person who rebuilt the town of Jericho, this man Hiel, offered his sons as sacrificial, and that is a very great and abominable sin to God. So maybe that's why it was mentioned here, because of all of the particular fallings away of and the worshiping of other gods. And I think it is the god Molech that is particularly known for having the worship ritual of offering your sons as a sacrifice. So it's a dire warning. So let's take a beginning look at King Ahab of Israel. He is the son of Omri. He began to rule over Israel in the 38th year of King Asa's reign in Judah. So King Asa was nearing the end of his rule. He reigned in Samaria. This is Ahab. He reigned in Samaria for 22 years. But Ahab, son of Omri, did what was evil in the Lord's sight, even more than any of the kings before him. And of course, we still have stories that we allude to in many ways in our culture about Ahab and his wife Jezebel. So enter the prophet Elijah, the Tishbite. So we know that Ahab, in all of his dastardly deeds, is confronted a number of times by the prophet Elijah. The message in this section is that life is made possible by the Lord alone, and the importance of the word, meaning the word of the Lord as spoken through prophets. And here's a statement that I wonder what you might think of what it means. History is the will of God, but the responsibility of man. What do you think that means? That's something to consider. History is the will of God, but it's the responsibility of man. Elijah is called to speak against Ahab, the king of Israel. Ahab had married the princess Jezebel from Sidon. Together they worshiped the Baal gods, they built temples, and they encouraged the worship of many gods throughout Israel. And this was a great abomination to the Lord. In 1 Kings 17, we can see this story of Elijah in three parts. It's God's provision for Elijah through the ravens. It's God's provision for Elijah through a Sidonian widow. Interestingly, not an Israelite woman, but a foreign woman. And God's recitation of this widow's child. So, bird food. In the Torah, you can find references in Levi and Deuteronomy, and even in Psalms and Proverbs and Isaiah, that ravens are regarded to be unclean birds because they are birds of prey. They eat carrion. These unclean birds of prey miraculously are used to feed Elijah, and he is indeed fed well with both bread and meat twice a day. Although the people are forbidden to eat unclean birds. So at first we have Elijah hiding at the brook of Kidron. And then it's ironic that the Lord would use a Phoenician, presumably a worshiper of Baal, to feed him. Not only that, but she's a widow, which in ancient Near Eastern culture means that she's probably destitute, as she had no husband to support her and her child. And in verse 8, God said to Elijah, "Go and live in the village of Zarephath, near the city of Sidon. I have instructed a widow there to feed you." And Elijah performs a miracle. The widow's son dies. Elijah performs the miracle of restoring him to life. He used a foreigner and both a foreigner and unclean birds to sustain the prophet. And we see that Jesus referred to this when he was teaching, and it's written in the book of Luke, and this is what it says. And Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says, and to other people, and he says to them, "You'll undoubtedly quote me this proverb, which says, 'Physician, heal yourself.' It means do miracles here in your hometown like those you did in Capernaum. But I tell you the truth, no prophet is accepted in his own hometown." And then he quotes the story of Elijah and Elisha. Certainly there were many needy widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the heavens were closed for 3.5 years and a severe famine devastated the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them. Instead, he was sent to a foreigner, a widow of Zarephath in the land of Sidon. And many in Israel had leprosy in the time of the prophet Elisha, but the only one that was healed was Naaman, a man from Syria. So in other words, God works through all people, even Gentiles, as they were referred to. In other words, people who were non-Israelite. And I found this picture, just found it, and I thought I put it in here for you to look at. It's a modern day picture because you can see in the background, you can see there are roads and so on. But it's a road down from Mount Precipice near Nazareth, the traditional site of the story for Luke 4, where Jesus refers to Elijah and Elisha. and the story of them that had taken place in First Kings. A nice view. And then, of course, we have the story of Elijah, and we heard about that in the film last week as well, where Elijah challenges all of the prophets of Baal, 450 prophets who were fed around the table of Queen Jezebel and King Ahab. In chapter 18, on Mount Carmel, Elijah calls down fire to burn the offerings. And this is a painting of that. An interesting and beautiful painting. So I'm going to show you a video by a different professor talking about this period of time of the books of Kings. So we're covering both First and Second Kings in these videos.
The history of Israel from the time of King Solomon in the 10th century BCE up until the destructions of the Israelite kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the late 8th and early 6th centuries is told in the Old Testament books of 1st and 2nd Kings. These books also introduce us to the office of prophet. And so a good portion of this lecture will be devoted to looking at prophecy in Israel, and specifically how prophecy is treated in the books of Kings. The books of Kings are considered by scholars to be part of the Deuteronomistic history, a comprehensive account running from Joshua through Kings that wasn't written to tell ancient Israelites about the past so much as to provide them with moral lessons to live by. Specifically, these books were designed to show that when God's law is followed, there's prosperity, and when the law is broken, disaster. We see an example of this right away. Early in the book of 1 Kings, the Israelite kingdom that has been ruled by David and Solomon is split into a divided monarchy, with the northern kingdom known as Israel and the southern kingdom, much smaller, known as Judah. Judah is home to Jerusalem and preserves the monarchy in the house of David. In contrast, the northern kingdom will go through multiple different dynasties. Chapter 12 of 1 Kings provides us with a theological explanation of why this happens. Basically, Solomon's son Rehoboam is approached by northern tribes and asked how harsh a king he will be compared to his father Solomon. Ignoring the advice of his elders and following the counsel of some of his young friends, Rehoboam says he will be extremely harsh and put northern tribes disproportionately into conscripted labor. 1 Kings 12, verse 16 states, "When all Israel heard the king had not listened to them, the people answered the king, 'We have no portion in David, no share in Jesse's son. So to your tents, O Israel, now look to your own house, O David.' So the Israelites returned to their homes." So they're not going to follow the house of David in the person of Rehoboam. Rehoboam rules over the Israelites in the towns of Judah, while the northern tribes form their own kingdom with the name Israel under a king named Jeroboam. So that account attributes the divide of the Israelite people primarily to unethical behavior by Rehoboam. But other explanations remain unsaid. Earlier in the Old Testament, in the book of Judges, much indicates that the average Israelite saw himself as a member of his own tribe rather than as an Israelite. The result in that book was multiple intertribal conflicts and civil war. Later, in the book of 1 Samuel, Saul's kingship is only regional, hardly extending beyond the boundaries of the tribe of Benjamin. After Saul, David was able to expand his kingship primarily by force, and then Solomon attempted to redistrict the entire kingdom because people wouldn't stop thinking of themselves in tribal terms. But the new boundaries didn't work either, because the way people thought about themselves didn't change. Even more basic environmental factors lay behind the division of the kingdoms. Distinct differences between the northern and southern kingdoms, Israel and Judah. The north was fertile. It lay on international trade routes, exposing its occupants to the larger world. The southern kingdom of Judah, by contrast, was isolated off the major trade routes and dedicated primarily to sheep and goat herding rather than to cereal farming. So a completely different kind of society developed in these two different environments, with large cities in the north and small villages in the south. As you might expect, the northern kingdom became much more prosperous, but primarily favoring the rich. And class distinctions became much greater in the northern kingdom than in the southern. Unfortunately, and this is in part due to those international trade routes, the Israelite royal dynasties intermarry with the Phoenicians. Israelite King Ahab marries the infamous Jezebel, and the Phoenician religion is imported into Israel, as we'll see. Prosperity and international exposure also meant that the northern kingdom was at war more often than, and conquered long before, the southern kingdom of Judah. We're going to spend some time zoomed in on Ahab and Jezebel as we read the story of the prophet Elijah. But first we have to talk about the nature of Israelite prophecy. A prophet is a spokesperson for God regarding the present, not primarily a foreteller of the future. A prophet is not a Jean Dixon, if you remember her, more of a Martin Luther King, a preacher. The 20th century Jewish theologian Abraham Joshua Heschel described a prophet as not just a messenger, but also a witness. A prophet feels the same things as God does about his people. That divine pathos of anxiety, worry, love, and anger. On the other hand, we're not talking about channeling spirits. God doesn't possess the prophet so much as inspire their words. The prophet's role is to be the conscience of the nation, calling people back to fidelity to their covenant with God. Specifically, those parts of it that deal with three areas. First, monotheism, the belief in one God, to which the threat is local, non-Israelite fertility gods, and also, more stubbornly, non-normative types of Yahweh worship. By which I mean this. Our traditional, ideal view of the temple doesn't square with some passages in the Bible. For instance, in 2 Kings, when King Josiah reforms the temple, he has to remove all sorts of strange religious paraphernalia and installations that were never in Solomon's design. And we know these aberrations from archaeology as well. There are figurines that archaeologists call pillar women. They're about 5 inches tall with gigantic breasts that they hold up with their hands. And these are unique to Judah, meaning they're not borrowed from some foreign religion. And although they're found all over Judah, half of them were recovered in Jerusalem, many a short distance from the temple. People thought this was okay in the religion of Judah. The second area of the prophet's concern is covenant morality, specifically social justice. Heschel, in his book on the prophets, says, in terms of statistics, prophets' statements are grossly inaccurate. Only a little bit of injustice, proportionally speaking, is still a large social ill. Society's tolerance of the small amount of injustice condemn the wider society. Or as Heschel writes, few are guilty, all are responsible. And the third area that prophets spend their attention on is God's will in current events. Prophets don't preach the Torah or God's written law. That was the job of the priests, and the prophets repeatedly condemned them for failing to do it. The priest was meant to pass on God's timeless commandments. The prophet was there to tell you about what God felt about today's news. Heschel wrote, the prophet's eye is directed to the contemporary scene, but his ear is inclined to God. He's not a wise old man on a mountaintop. He's in the temple. He's in the court. God's position on current events is a moving target. So in 1 century, the prophet Isaiah tells the king not to surrender to a besieging army. God will defend his people. In the next century, the prophet Jeremiah tells the king, surrender to the besieging army because God has chosen to punish us. Although people expect the message to be consistent, it's not that God has changed, but the situation has changed, so the message is different. And the prophets are not themselves reformers. Especially after we get through the first few examples, they are not going to tear down pagan altars. They're going to preach to others to do so. Prophets are not going to open soup kitchens and homeless shelters. They're going to preach about injustice. As we've said, they're the conscience of Israel, not its reformers. And they're primarily oral proclaimers. This is important for understanding how we get prophetic books. Only the late books, the books of Zechariah, Ezekiel, for example, were written from the get-go. The earlier prophets never wrote anything. It fell to others to collect what had been preached, to select from it, and to arrange it. We really see a prophet first in Elijah, here in the books of Kings. There's no book of the prophet Elijah, but a long oral tradition was gathered into documents about Elijah, and those eventually were worked into 1 Kings 17 through 19. 1 Kings 17:1 states, Elijah said to Ahab, as the Lord lives, the God of Israel whom I serve, there will be no dew or rain except by my word. Then at the end of the chapter, verse 24 tells us that a woman answers Elijah with the words, now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord is truly in your mouth. So the whole chapter is set off by inclusion in verses 1 and 24 by repeating the word, which we'll see is really important. Notice it doesn't say there will be no rain until God says so. It says there'll be no rain until, quote, I, Elijah, say so. And that bold word that Elijah poses to the king raises a question about the authority of the word. How dare he speak to me like this? Now, if you scan this chapter, you'll see the term word over and over again. In verse 2, the word of the Lord comes to Elijah and tells him where to flee during the drought. Verse 5, so he went and did according to the word of the Lord, and he flees to where ravens provide for him food and water. In verses 6 and verse 8, the word of the Lord comes to him and tells him to go to Phoenicia. When he's there, he meets a widow and her son who are about to starve to death. In verse 10, with his word, he asks for water, and in the next verse for bread. Now, obviously, the widow doesn't want to share her meager resources because there's only enough for one more meal. Nevertheless, Elijah says, trust me, feed me, and you won't starve. And miraculously, their flour and oil last until the drought ends. Notice this pattern. The word comes from the Lord to Elijah in verse 2. By following it, he lives. The word comes from the Lord to Elijah in verse 8, and then from Elijah to the woman in verse 10. And they live when they obey. Then in verse 17, the son of this woman, that's the widow, became ill, and his illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. So in verse 18, she appeals to Elijah. Then in verse 20, Elijah cried to the Lord. In verse 22, the Lord, remarkably, listens to the prayer of Elijah, and the boy's healed. So, to summarize, when Elijah listens to God's word, he lives. The woman listens to Elijah's word and lives. God listens to Elijah's word, and the boy lives. This begs the question, will Ahab listen? If he does, he lives. All of this works because of the source of the power, and power is related to authority. When Elijah speaks, God speaks. When Elijah speaks, God listens. Will Ahab listen? In chapter 18, Elijah confronts Ahab and the priests and prophets of the god Baal. He proposes a contest to see who's the real god. Now we need a little background to understand what happens in this chapter. As we said earlier, Ahab's marriage to a Phoenician queen introduces a foreign religion. Ahab and Jezebel, really, they're attempting to establish an absolute monarchy. And importing the worship of the fertility god Baal is part of that. As king and queen, Ahab and Jezebel assume the role of Baal's chief priests. We know a lot about the religion of Baal from texts that were uncovered at an archaeological site called Ugarit in northern Syria. And these texts show us that the king was always the high priest of Baal, as well as his chief prophet. Baal is also a storm god. In this part of the Middle East, fertility is tied to rain. The contest on Mount Carmel that we're about to read is about whether the storm god can bring lightning or not. And the contest will show how Yahweh, the Hebrew God, alone has power, while Baal, the Phoenician god, is impotent, which is rather ironic for a fertility god. The point is to call the people back to their original obligations under the covenant with God. In 1 Kings 18:19, the prophet Elijah says, "Now therefore, send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal." Now, Mount Carmel is modern Haifa. It's a northern port city in contemporary Israel. And there's a really good reason why this is where the contest takes place. Mount Carmel is a mountain peak, a cape sort of sticking out into the Mediterranean. And from it, you can see Phoenicia, home of Jezebel and of Baal. Mount Carmel was also a sanctuary of Baal. We know that going back to 15th century BCE Egyptian texts. A 4th century BCE text calls it a mountain holy to the storm god. And even as late as the Roman Empire, Vespasian sacrificed there to Baal. So Elijah convenes a contest in which both sets of prophets will arrange a sacrifice to see which god can bring down fire, or strike the offering with lightning, I suppose. 18 verse 25. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourself one bull and prepare it, and call upon the name of your God, but set no fire to it." And they called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." There was no voice, no one answered. And they limped around the altar they had made. And limped might not be the right translation. It's a hopping dance. The 4th century Greek writer Heliodorus describes a hopping dance that Phoenicians performed for their god Baal, and uses the same Greek word as found in the Greek translation of 1 Kings. Continuing, 1827. At noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry louder, for he is a god. Maybe he's musing, or he's relieving himself, or he's on a journey. Perhaps he's asleep and must be awakened." Now verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come a little closer." Verse 38. Then fire from the Lord descended and consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the earth, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. When they saw this, all the people flung themselves on their faces and cried out, "The Lord alone is God, the Lord alone is God." Verse 40, and Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, that not one escape." Elijah took the prophets down to the Kishon brook and slaughtered them there. There's still a problem, of course, which is Ahab and Jezebel. After chapter 19, verse 1, when Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, "This and more may the gods do if by this time tomorrow I've not made you like one of them." So frightened for his life, Elijah flees into the desert. And in verse 4, he prays that he might die. "Now, Lord, take my life." It's weird. Jezebel wants to take his life, so he runs away and prays to die. Seems like this could have been accomplished fairly quickly by just hanging around Israel. And why the sudden despair? we'll see that chapter 19 presents an unflattering picture of Elijah. Now, fortified by an angel bringing food, Elijah keeps fleeing until verse 8, quote, he walked for 40 days and 40 nights as far as the mountain of God, Horeb, and there he went into the cave and spent the night. Horeb is Mount Sinai, where Moses received the law from God during the Exodus. The text doesn't say he went into a cave, as some translations read. It says he went into the cave. It's the same cave where God appeared before Moses in Exodus chapter 33, verses 21 to 23. In many ways, Elijah is a new Moses as he stands now where Moses did. Verse 9, and the word of the Lord came to him, why are you here? Elijah replied, I am moved by the zeal for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenants, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to the sword. I alone am left. Notice Elijah doesn't blame Ahab and Jezebel. Instead, he blames the Israelite people, whom the last we saw them seemed to be on his side. And although Elijah claims, I alone am left, we will find out in verse 18 that there are 7,000 others also. In fact, in no other place of the Old Testament do so many prophets appear in such short space. Elijah is hardly alone. Keep reading, verse 11. God called, stand on the mountain before the Lord. But Elijah doesn't do that. He won't come out until the end of verse 13. And then we get a famous passage that is quite beautiful. The Lord passed by. There was a great and mighty wind splitting mountains and shattering rocks by the power of the Lord. The Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. The Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his mantle about his face and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Very poetic, but I think it's misunderstood. These other things, the gale and the earthquake and the fire, these are ways that God appears in other parts of the Old Testament. The point is not that God is never in such things. And I don't think that this is the climax here, the still small voice, because God immediately says, why are you here, Elijah? And Elijah answered, I am moved by the zeal for the Lord. In other words, the same exact thing he said in verse 10. In other words, he just starts repeating the exact same words, same mantra, verbatim. I think Elijah is saying, I'm done. Mic drop. Let's see how God responds. The Lord said to him, go back the way you came. When you get there, anoint Hazael as king over Aram, anoint Jehu as king of Israel, and Elisha to succeed you as prophet. Whoever escapes the sword of Hazael shall be slain by Jehu. Whoever escapes the sword of Jehu shall be slain by Elisha. Now, if we follow the narrative through, this means that God is sending Elijah on a new mission that will lead to the fall of Israel. But Elijah doesn't end up doing any of this. Instead, the only thing he does is anoint Elisha as his successor. I think God's telling Elijah to stop whining, but also signaling that he can be replaced. A key to understanding all of this is taking note once more that Elijah is in Moses' cave. Like Moses, Elijah has met an angel in the desert, gone 40 days without food, appointed a successor, killed false worshipers, splits bodies of water, and like Moses, there will be no burial place for him. But if you read Exodus 33, it shows us that what Moses was doing in the cave was interceding for sinful Israel. God had told Moses, I mean to wipe out Israel and start over with you. But Moses pleaded for the nations, and God was merciful. In contrast, Elijah blames the nation. He accuses instead of intercedes. No wonder God's finished with him. Now, we're not going to read as closely any of the stories of the prophet Elisha, who also appears in the book of 2 Kings and is much more of a miracle worker than Elijah, less political. More importantly, 2 Kings records the decline of the northern kingdom that Elijah sets in motion. Israel will eventually fall to the rising empire of Assyria. The 8th century Assyrian king Sargon II will finish it off in 702 BCE. 2 Kings 17 and 18 describe how the Assyrians deport the inhabitants to other parts of their empire. Those deportees become the so-called 10 lost tribes. There aren't really 10 lost tribes of Israel out there somewhere waiting to be discovered in some other part of the world. The deported Israelites simply assimilated into Assyrian society. 2 Kings says the Assyrians imported foreigners into Israel, and they came to worship Yahweh while preserving some of their foreign religions. These are the people that come to be known as Samaritans. Jewish writings have a strong prejudice against them as not quite Jewish, being imported foreigners. Today, there are about 300 Samaritans living near Samaria, and there's also a community in Tel Aviv. Their tradition holds that they are the descendants of the Israelite remnant not deported by the Assyrians. Probably there's a bit of truth in both, their tradition and 2 Kings, a mix of remnant and foreigners. Assyria had also invaded the southern kingdom of Judah, which was largely bypassed by most expanding empires because it was unimportant and not strategic, and also difficult terrain. The Assyrian leader Sennacherib campaigned against Judah's king Hezekiah in 704, and 5 different accounts in Assyrian records describe the invasion. 46 Judean cities are besieged. Lots of captives are taken. If you're ever in London and you visit the British Museum, you can see inscriptions showing the Assyrian siege of the Judean city of Lachish. And you can also visit Lachish in present-day Israel, where it's been excavated. After the fall of Lachish, Sennacherib says, "I imprisoned Hezekiah in Jerusalem." In other words, he was blockaded. Hezekiah undertook multiple engineering endeavors to defend Jerusalem. He built what's now called the Broad Wall, dug a tunnel for water to bring water into the city. If you're ever in Jerusalem, you can walk through it. The Assyrian sources say Sennacherib went home without conquering Jerusalem, but that Hezekiah sent a huge tribute. 2 Kings chapters 18 and 19 say God struck the besieging army dead, just as Isaiah had prophesied he would to defend Jerusalem. In fact, part of the explanation for the Assyrian retreat was the approach of an Egyptian army under the leadership of the ruling Ethiopian dynasty, a combined Ethiopian-Egyptian army that the Assyrians did not want to confront. But Judah was left badly devastated. The Assyrian Empire fell in 612, but Judah's days were numbered. The Babylonian Empire rises in 605 under the king Nebuchadnezzar, and Judah falls under its sway in 2 Kings 24. Judah was determined to be independent. Her last kings, the last kings of the house of David, foolishly rebel against Babylon. In 2 Kings 24:10, 597 BCE, Jerusalem falls. Thousands of people are taken captive to Babylon, mostly nobles. 2 Kings says that the king, Jehoiakim, was deported and provided for in Babylon, as Babylonian records confirm. And the Babylonians put a new king in place. That king, Zedekiah, again, foolishly revolts. As 2 Kings 25 recounts, the city of Jerusalem falls to Nebuchadnezzar in July of 586, the 9th of Av by the Hebrew calendar. The temple is demolished. Its goods are taken to Babylon. Zedekiah's eyes are put out, and he's taken in chains to Babylon, ending the reign of the house of David. And the nobles, the merchants, and the officers of Judah go into exile in Babylon. But in the last verses of this book, hope is offered as we zoom in on a character we might have forgotten about, King Jehoiakim, exiled back in 597 BCE. 2 Kings 25, verses 27 to 29 says, "In the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim of Judah, the king of Babylon, in the year he became king, pardoned King Jehoiakim of Judah and released him from prison. He treated him with kindness and gave him a throne above those of the other kings who were with him in Babylon. So Jehoiakim removed his prison garments and for the rest of his life always ate at the king's table." In other words, the royal family was still alive. There's hope that the line of David will continue, and just maybe Israel could return from exile. God's promise to David that his dynasty will always rule over Jerusalem, seemingly thrown to the wind by the fall of the kingdom, may prove true after all. Stay tuned.
That was a lot to think about. Not only focusing on the prophet Elijah, but all of the different events in the Judean Empire or Judean rule and different kings and what happens to them. So we got a really good overview of the whole thing from this. And we will continue with it. We will keep on reading and kind of catch up to the videos that we've seen this overview with. By next week, we will I will include the video on Assyria and the rise of Assyria. So in the meantime, just keep reading your books of Kings and thinking about all that you've learned from the video from last week and this week that helps in you to understand some of the background. And I leave you with another blessing this week called the love and affection of the angels. The love and affection of the angels be to you. The love and the affection of the saints be to you. The love and affection of heaven be to you, to guard you and to cherish you. And it is Valentine's Day at the end of this week. So may you have a happy Valentine's or Galentine's or Guy-entine's Day. And here is King Solomon, the man of many wives and concubines, which one wife is very brave, speaking out and saying, perhaps it's time you slow down with all the romantic songs, as he writes yet another serenade. I found a video called The History of Jerusalem on YouTube. If you are so inclined to watch it, I won't show it here because it's quite lengthy. But it is very, very interesting and shows the entire history of Jerusalem from the time it's first a settlement, how it comes to be to what it is to today.